cross live now to the Sydney CBD and catch up with former Labor Premier of New South Wales, former Federal Labor Foreign Minister Bob Carr joining us. Thanks for catching up again, Bob. I want to start off on the Olympics. Of course, this is something very dear to your heart. After Sydney hosted the Games in 2000, you're strongly behind Queensland's bid for the 2032 Olympic Games, but you believe the federal government needs to swing in quickly and back that?
Yeah, I do, and I think the biggest contribution they can make is by doing something that's in their interests anyway, and that is the generic promotion of Australia. That is part of the Queensland presentation to the IOC. The big role for the federal government is in helping Queensland secure the bid to get the Games, and that really means deploying Australia's international force, international personality, in the way that was done very effectively to get the IOC to say in 1993, Sydney can run the Games in 2000.
Yes, perhaps as a former Tourism Commission boss, Scott Morrison ought to understand that viscerally. As you say, this requires not just the direct lobbying effort of the IOC, of the Australian Olympic Committee, but also a really full court press, if you like, from Australian diplomats right around the world.
Absolutely. Well, consider there are 55 countries in Africa. I'm not sure how many of them have got representation on the IOC, if it's all or some of them, but I certainly know our bid to get the IOC to give us the Games in 1993 involved a big push in Africa. I think we got Gough Whitlam to visit African capitals, for example. John Coates would know so much about this, would be dependent on his advice, and Rod McGeoch, of course, who headed the bid committee. But yeah, you do need all Australian embassies giving this their highest priority. There's some other bits of advice I've got as well.
And what other bits of advice have you got? It's a pretty sordid game. Let's be fair here. We've all read about it and seen examples of the sort of gifts and glad handing that goes on to sway votes for these sort of things. Hopefully Australia stays right above that and just presses the case for a great Games in Australia. But what else would you suggest the federal government in particular needs to do?
Yeah, the IOC, to give it credit, has cleaned up its act. I think they got Henry Kissinger in to give them advice. In that capacity, Henry, I think, was an ex officio member of the IOC, and I spent a bit of time with him in Sydney in 2000. But his role with the IOC had been to see that governance matters had been straightened out. So I'm confident that these days it's a clean process. I think we've got to give attention to our environmental credentials. They will want to know that these Games are going to be the cleanest, the greenest that they've ever been. And that means every structure will have to tick off all the boxes that the Green Building Council would give us, 6-star ratings, no contribution, either on-site or off-site, to greenhouse, net zero ratings for every structure in the Games, but according to a very tough methodology. Australia does pretty well at clean buildings, commercial rather than residential, and it's where we've got a lot of expertise to draw on, but that needs to be absolutely bedded down, because the AOC is going to be very attentive to the environmental credentials.
On that front, it might help if activists and politicians stop telling the world that the Great Barrier Reef is dead.
Well, listen, we've had this argument before, Chris. I think we're in opposite camps on this. I'm very concerned about the weight of scientific opinion on the coral bleaching, and the weight of it really is that something serious is happening here. I think at meetings next year of the World Heritage Commission, Australia is going to be called to account for its vulnerability when it comes to the management of the reef and the implications of our climate stance for the reef. But let's set aside that for the moment. I'd be less than honest if I didn't say to Canberra that when we get into this thing, environment is going to rate very highly indeed as we leverage the advantages of southeastern Queensland.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that, but I think yeah, it's very helpful to show that the reef is great now, that people are visiting it, rather than just correct this misconception that's about the place. Barack Obama was telling everyone he wanted to bring his daughters there before the reef wasn't there to see anymore. So we've got to have some perspective in these things. Just on that very briefly, I don't want to I'm about to speak to Matt Keane, but when it comes to bushfires and New South Wales, you, I think, quite rightly point to the fact that you declared a lot of national parks in your time as Premier of New South Wales, added vastly to the sort of wilderness stocks of the state. Are you concerned that the national parks, whether it be through staffing or their practices, hasn't done enough to manage fuel loads in those parks?
After every bushfire crisis, Chris, you've got references being made to hazard reduction burning. And we all know that fire has played a part in the Australian landscape over thousands of years. At 7-year fire cycles in parts of Australia, used very smartly, very scientifically by Aboriginal Australians. But our legislation in New South Wales, as a result of fire crises, including a very bad one in 93-94, really allows the fire experts to determine what level of hazard reduction you need. And I'd be surprised if Matt Keane didn't remind you that the legislation gives the weight, gives the final say to the men and women who've got responsibility for seeing that we get through fire crises. But we've got to wait. I've got to insist on this, as I wrote in the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age only a couple of days ago. We've had countless warnings from the CSIRO and the Bureau of Meteorology since 1988 that the gradual warming of the Australian landmass has made the frequency of high-risk fire days very much more common. We're on a path now where the concentration of such days in the calendar is immeasurably greater. I think the one CSIRO report, 2005, said that we're looking at something that could be up to a 20% increase by 2020, next year, in the number of days where you can expect a high fire risk. Yeah,
I'm about to take all that up with Matt Keane, but that's right. We've always had high fire risk days, and the forecast is perhaps we'll have more of them. I just want to get
more of them.
Yeah, exactly. I just want to very briefly get your response. It's a big issue, I know, but Peter Harcher, in writing about China and links between politicians, Labor and Liberal, in China and this country, he's dubbed you as one of the, quote, useful idiots for China in this country and in the public debate. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, I respond to it by saying this. In every respect, what I've advocated as a pragmatic policy of engagement towards China is what we had in place under the Abbott government. Under the Abbott government. In other words, there's not a single respect of the China policy I've advocated that is different, and I've said this in print, I said this in your paper, The Australian, that is remotely different from the China policy practiced by Prime Minister Abbott, who concluded a free trade agreement with China and elevated the relationship to comprehensive strategic partnership. In every respect, including diplomatic criticisms of China over the South China Sea, my policy was aligned with that of Abbott. I'm at odds with the drift in Australian-China diplomatic relations since early 2017 under Turnbull. So if Harcher's criticising me and he's become an anti-China zealot with all the zeal of a convert, then he's attacking where Australia was under a Conservative Prime Minister in up till 2016. And that's the position I've advocated publicly then and more recently.
There has been a high degree of bipartisanship in China policy, there's no doubt about that. Thanks so much for joining us again, Bob Carr.
Terrific, Chris, thank you.